That's all I do. Cannot drink that now. So now I have to figure out. Yeah, well, you need to bring food. I figured that like that's what well, yeah. I don't know exactly.
All right. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. All righty. Okay. Oh, I'm a couple minutes late. Technical difficulties. All right. So, welcome back. So to SOS 377 Sociology of Youth. We are going to keep talking about the history of youth and childhood in a little bit. So that's back up here. So if you want to ask questions, you can always raise your hand, but it's also there for you. Okay, so this question, I don't know when it came. What's the origin behind children not being allowed to know about sex? It's a natural process. So I wouldn't say that the question, in a sense, is entirely correct, right? Children are going to know certain things about sex. It's more, in a sense, when you tell them what, right? And that, you could say maybe it goes back to the Victorian period, at least for English-speaking cultures. It probably goes back to some basic sort of religious beliefs as well. I don't know the exact origins, but I think what's pretty clear, and I think what Postman would say, is it's not that children aren't allowed to know anything about sex. It's just that information about it is sort of doled out slowly over time as adults think it's appropriate, right? So it's, how to put it? It's like to a 5-year-old, you try to present it in ways that are appropriate to a 5-year-old. Like when a mommy and daddy love each other very much, blah, 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 blah. Or that sort of things. I'll leave all those talks to my wife. I'm not going to do that. Everyone's good at certain things. Not me. So I think that would be a more, I think maybe I'm sidestepping the question, and that's okay. I think that's probably a more correct kind of way to look at it. It's not like, nothing is known at different stages. It's the idea that certain aspects are going to be known, and you're going to dole that information out over an appropriate period of time, right? So the child can understand, based on their kind of maturity, sex, right? And so you give them what you think is appropriate based on your cognitive development, because they're not experiencing it firsthand, right? It's not something that, like in the Middle Ages, they would have been seeing, their mom and dad do in the bed on the other side of the hut. It's something that gets, there's no sense of private space. As that private space, forms, and we'll talk about that a little bit, hopefully today, as you get the formation of kind of a distinction between the public and the private, along with that, you get this distinction that, sex is part of that private sphere, and that children need to be sort of let in on that slowly over time. Okay, but it's a good question. Okay, how am I doing? Oh, I think we left off with this slide on Wednesday. I know what day of the week it is. Yesterday, I was convinced in my Tuesday-Thursday class, I was convinced that it was Wednesday and that I was meeting with that class again on Friday, and they looked very confused, but I know what day of the week it is. I'm good. It's Friday. Okay, so we talked about this, right? And again, what Postman calls the incunabula of childhood, or the cradle of childhood, right? Where childhood, this idea of childhood, gets sort of raised and matures over time. Okay, so we ended off, right, with this sort of idea that as we shift from an oral culture to an emerging print culture, this new category of children in the sort of modern sense that we think of them. And again, you know, a couple of the things that we think of about children, there's this idea of innocence, and there's this idea of like a delay in economic activity. I'm just going to put dollar signs there. Delay in them being part of economic activity, right? And that they need to be nurtured into adulthood sort of comes out of this period for postmen, right? Because in order to enter adulthood and really function in the world, you start to need to learn how to read. And for that, you actually need a committed period of time where young people are protected from being part of the economy, right? Where basically they're not having to work, they're not expected to be part of the economic engine that keeps their families going. And obviously, you know, I said this has nation-state implications. Very quickly, you know, literate populations engaged in science, learning, economically outperform others. And very quickly it becomes evident that an educated population is going to be a net benefit. Okay, so, and like I said, it spreads really quickly, right? By 1560, the Scottish, they're so wonderful, except for their music and their food. But aside from that, the Scottish are wonderful. Great inventors, terrible cooks. I tried haggis when I was in Scotland. It was not good. It was not good. I wanted to like it, but I didn't. Okay, and I can't get my head around the bagpipes either. I'm sorry. If you're Scottish, you're like, oh, but it's so beautiful. No, you're wrong. Okay, but the Scottish are wonderful, right? And only 120 years after the invention of the printing press, which again, by historical standards, this is really, really quick. They're calling for essentially public education. Okay, now for postmen, one of the things he notes, where literacy is high, you have schools, and that seems pretty obvious. Why? Because people are, you know, need to be instructed in reading, and the sooner you get to it, right, the better. At a certain point, it becomes harder for, say, adults to learn how to read at a really high level. But if you catch people in childhood, they will learn to read relatively well, as long as you work them through, you know, the process. Now, for postmen, what he says is where there are schools, you start to get this notion of childhood developing. And very critically, one of the first places that we get a modern notion of childhood, oops, that should be England. Or England, yeah, England. England, I saw I misspelled it, but my brain is just not working. England, right? The English. You can thank them for many things, and this as well. So, in 1480, right, so this is 40 years after the invention of the printing press, there are 34 schools in England. So this, when we talk about England, we're not talking about the whole UK, right? We're just talking about that south part, right? What we would think of like the area around London and to the north. So not Wales, not Scotland, just England. There are 34 schools in England 40 years after the development of the printing press. By 1660, right? So just a hair over 200 years later, there are 444, or one about every 12 miles. So it goes from a country with very few schools to a country with a lot of schools very quickly. And I think, not surprisingly, England ends up being, you know, essentially the first industrial nation. It ends up being, you know, at the forefront economically, essentially until the United States surpasses it sometime in the 19th century. So it has a, you know, from the 17th to the 19th century, England rides out the advantages it gets from adopting literacy really quickly compared to its, especially its continental rivals like France and Germany. Okay, now here's the really important part for Postman. He suggests, and I think there's good backing for this, that schools ultimately change the relationship between adults and children. And he's here drawing on a lot of the work of a guy named Philip Aries, who's sometimes considered a bit controversial, but if you've read his book, he wrote a book in the 1960s on the history of childhood, and it's a really interesting kind of a piece of work. And what he suggests is that in the Middle Ages, and he bases this on a bunch of stuff like the art and family portraits of the time, children were thought of more as miniature adults, right? Their clothing was very, once they passed, infancy, basically, they were 4 or 5. They went from things like dressing gowns, right? So just these generic white gowns that young children wore, to clothing that very closely mirrored the clothing of adults. But they were also put to work, right? They were economic agents. They learned a trade. Agents. They learned a trade. They started working on the family farm, and whatever tasks they could perform physically, they were part of, so they were basically adults in almost every sense. So they were miniature adults. And Postman suggests that literacy, because you then kind of have to learn to enter the adult world, right? You have to be taught that literary skill, or that skill of reading. They go to being considered unformed adults, right? The goal of the teacher and of the parent, and you'll see this in, say, the works of Martin Luther, right? So I don't know if you know who Martin Luther is. If you don't know who Martin Luther is, shame on you, because Martin Luther is a very important figure in Western history, right? He's the one who kicks off the Protestant Reformation in 1517. And Luther, right, so he splits off from Catholicism, which I think I'll talk about in a second here too. He splits off from Catholicism. But one of the things that Luther is really on about, and again, he's less than a century after the invention of the printing press, is that every Christian should learn to read the Bible. And he says, the principal teachers of their kids should be parents, right? So the task of shaping children goes to school teachers and the child's parents. Okay, so Postman suggests under this apprenticeship system, right, where you went off and learned how to be a cobbler or a blacksmith, basically childhood, right, your time as an innocent, economically inactive agent probably ends somewhere around 6 or 7. From the time we start getting schools, the period of kind of delaying a lot of adult responsibility gets longer and longer over time, right? So it'll start, a few years where you'll learn basic literacy skills. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble speaking today. It's because my tea is too hot to drink, because my mug is foolishly too good at insulating things. So even though I made it an hour ago, it is still scalding hot. So it burned my tongue and then fall down. Okay. Right. Probably initially you're talking about, maybe 3 years. And this is going to vary a lot. But think about you today, right? And people in your generation. You're probably talking about being at least somewhat shielded from some of the responsibility, not everyone, but for a lot of people, for something in the range of about, 20 years. Certainly, right, you would be shielded, at least in some sense, for 18, right, until you graduate from high school, at least, right? So 5 years, before you start 4 or 5 years before you start kindergarten, and then 12 years of primary and secondary school. So this goes from, basically at 6, you were like, okay, go off and earn your living, son, to today where it's like, at 23, it's like, okay, go off and earn your living. Please, God, get out of my house, right? My kids are not there yet, but my daughter has subsequently informed me, she's like, I'm going to live here for as long as possible. Like, thrilling. Good for you. No, I love my kids. I'm only joking. Okay, so this gets longer and longer, and there's lots of arguments, right? And like I said, in the course, we're going to talk about, a period roughly from 12 to 29, and this period from, 19 to 29, very recently, sociologists started referring to this as emerging adulthood, right? So it's still a period where people are emerging into adulthood, right? You're a legal adult, but in terms of your cultural kind of position, you have yet to fully enter adulthood. We'll talk about this endlessly through the course. It's not Postman's point. But, that idea that childhood and youth are going to get longer and longer is definitely there. Okay. Learning, he says, learning becomes sequential and hierarchical, right? The education system is set up basically to do one thing, to take you from simple concepts and work you, over whatever period you are in school to things that are more complex, right? And the idea is you're going to master this and every tier along the way to get to here, right? So think of reading, right? You start out in the first grade and you have those little readers, right, where you read about, I don't know what they are anymore, actually, because now they're all online. But they're the little readers, right? It's a short story of 10 pages just to get your vocabulary. And you work your way up, and by the time you get to high school, ostensibly you're reading, right, some Shakespeare plays and other more complex works. Same thing with math, right? You're kind of worked up the scale from basic addition, subtraction, all the way up to calculus or I guess you're sociology students, so, grade 12 math, maybe not calculus. I'm kidding. I am joking. You're all brilliant. I'm sure you all did calculus. I'm sure you're all fine. Okay, so it becomes sequential, right? So it follows a sequence and it builds, from simple to complex. So it becomes hierarchical. You need that basic skill to move on to another. The other thing that happens, again, slowly over time. Doesn't happen all at once, right? It doesn't happen in 1440. It's this process that rolls out over 500 years. But students start to be grouped by age, right? So you start to get this idea of grades, right? So, you have kinder, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, right? Based on the age of the child. So rather than the ability, right? You don't look at the ability, you look at the age and you start clustering young, children together. Basically because, as they start teaching more people, it's noticed that children of the same age tend to have the same developmental abilities, right? Their abilities to, outside of a few exceptions, their abilities to, read, write, do math, and all of those things are approximately the same, right? They start out roughly at the same place and you kind of roll them along. Yes, there's always that one kid, in a school. My wife's been a teacher for a long time. That's, in grade 1's reading like the Harry Potter books, but that's the exception rather than the rule, right? Typically, 6-year-olds have roughly similar abilities and they start to be classed in that way. Okay. So, why? Oh, I don't know what's going on. So, by separating people into classes according to their ability, you start to then get the emergence of specific cultures geared at those age groups and at youth. And you get youth culture, youth clothing. This probably finds its sort of most complete form once we get to the 1960s, right? At the point where you sort of get compulsory public education and you get a real youth culture forming that's really pretty cohesive. But even before then, right, you start to get youth cultures, right? And you start to get, this idea that because we're noticing certain characteristics, we'll start to produce things for people that have those characteristics. So you get things like, children's clothing. Again, relatively quickly, after, so we're talking 160 years after the invention of the printing press. You're talking about distinct children's clothing. Children's language starts to be differentiated, right, in writing. You get the first books on pediatrics. Now, you have a lot of advance in medicine going on as well because there's a lot more learning, but you get the first books on pediatrics written, sometime prior to 1600, right? We're not exactly sure, but sometime in the late 16th century. So, and then the first children's books, so books aimed specifically at children, and the first one that we actually have recorded is this one, History of Jack the Giant Killer, is published in 1744, right? So it's taken about 300 years going from, Gutenberg's Bible to Jack and the Giant Killer, right? So this is it, like I said, this is a process that rolls out really, really slowly over time. Okay. Wow, 22 minutes gone already. So, some of the other things that happen, and it's not all just down to the printing press. There's a lot of economic changes that are going on as well. The modern nuclear family starts to emerge, right? You start to get this, and again, the first place this happens is really in England. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. The English middle class, for a lot of historical reasons that are not the purview of this course, becomes relatively wealthy, right? A really big merchant class emerges in England that's quite wealthy, and along with that wealth comes a couple of things. So the ability, A, to separate from extended family groups in more concerted ways, right? And to set up kind of, wife, husband, children, nuclear families. A kind of Protestant ethos as well, right? So, because, our good buddy Henry VIII, Henry VII, splits the church in England from the Roman Catholic Church, and it basically turns the country Protestant. And with that, you get that Protestant assumption that everybody should be able to read the Bible, right, and make their own choices about, religious beliefs. And with this, and again, Martin Luther contributes to this in his Lutheran Catechism, there's a stress on parents becoming kind of key educators for their children. So parents will teach their kids to read and write, but in the wealthy classes, they also do things like hire tutors and, a governess. So if you've ever watched like shows that, like some version of Jane Austen, right? What's the Pride and Prejudice, right? You have these sort of people running around these English estate manors, right? Tutors and governesses that, that are helping to educate children, right? So, but that's the responsibility of the parents to pay for that. Okay, bless you. The middle class in England then uses their wealth to buy larger segmented homes, right? So you go from, the kind of apartments in the industrial cities to like these country estates, right, where there's, what am I drawing? No. Okay, I'm going to erase that. It was a house, but then I realized, you're not that good at drawing. Stop. Uh-oh. Technology down. Okay, so get larger segmented houses, right? You get, private bedrooms for parents and a nursery for children, right? So if you've ever seen the Disney movie Peter Pan, right? What's going on at the beginning of Peter Pan is you have Wendy and her two brothers and their dog, Nanny, sleeping in this room, the nursery, right? And one of the sort of traumatic moments at the beginning of Peter Pan is that Wendy, sort of becoming a young woman, is being told by her parents that she needs to grow up and move out of the nursery, right? And no longer essentially be a child. But what's kind of interesting for our purposes there is that you have this, middle class British family where you have this separate space, right, for the children to be children, to sleep, very much separate from their parents, right? A special room. And presumably Wendy is then going to be moved to her own space as well, separate from the parents. So you get these segmented homes, and this contributes to a division of spaces, creating a sort of idea of private space versus public space, right? Spaces where you are, allowed to, where you are in private with your family only, and where, certain things can be discussed, and a public space where other things shouldn't be discussed, right? Now, I mean, again, think of this. If you've ever seen shows like Downton Abbey, right, and you notice that that's in the 20th century, but it's the same kind of ethos, that the men at a certain point after dinner go off to the smoking room to drink whiskey and smoke cigars and talk politics and economics. They're doing that, again, because you've had this creation of a private and public space. They're moving to a private space where, without shame, you can discuss things like politics, economics, religion, sex, away from the prying ears of those sensitive children. And of course, the other group that shouldn't hear about those things, women, right? Again, in that period, I'm not saying that. Don't write any emails to the chair. That's the attitude at the time. So, I'm sorry, I make my slides so messy. Erase again. So, why does it happen here and why in England? England has that really developed middle class. They're very wealthy, right? They've benefited enormously from, the huge trade in English wool at first, and then England's New World colonies where they've generated a lot of wealth. So this will take centuries to trickle down to the lower classes, right, to the working class, but it also takes a while to trickle down to other parts of the European continent and to the Americas, where it's not evident immediately. Okay. The incunabula of childhood, 6. Okay, I should have come up with better slide titles at a certain point. Maybe I'll rename them and I'll use just lyrics from Taylor Swift songs. So the other thing that for Postman is really important, and this is what education does, right? Adults come to be in control of the symbolic environment of their young, right? So you control the transition from childhood to adulthood essentially by controlling information, right? By controlling what they're allowed to know and by leading them very deliberately through a series of intellectual tasks, right? Through learning, reading, history, language, classical literature, all of those things. And for Postman, all of this has the effect of building adults and building a bunch of other things that we tend to value, right? Individuality, right? And for Postman, because he's a media ecologist, and he has the specific set of beliefs that the media we use transform us in certain ways as societies and individuals, it leads to more individuality because your relationship with the book is sort of one-to-one, right? When you sit down with a good book and you open it, right, you are interacting with that, just you and the book, right? Unless you're doing like a slam poetry reading down at some cafe, but let's not talk about that. Because who needs slam poetry? Logical and sequential thinking, right? Because language is syntactic, right? It's organized in particular ways. And if you're reading a treatise or an argument, right, an essay of some kind, you're going to be asked to think logically and sequentially to understand and then to analyze what you're reading. High order abstraction, because a lot of what reading does is take you out of the concrete and into the abstract, right? Like the reason that you can imagine Hogwarts maybe you've seen the movies where it was done for you, but right, if you read J.K. Rowling or any other book, you're abstracting, right? You're being described something and creating it in your head, right? You sort of imagine what Hogwarts looks like in your mind, right? And that is a sort of abstraction. And as you get to be a better reader, you can abstract all sorts of philosophical arguments and just about anything. You can experience any part of the world in a sense, by reading about it. Like I'd never been to St. Petersburg, but I'd been to St. Petersburg by reading Dostoevsky, right? I'd never been to Moscow, but I'd been to Moscow by reading Bulgakov, right? So you can abstract things that you're not experiencing directly. And an important one for Postman, and this is where, he doesn't like television, and I'm sure he would love TikTok. That's sarcastic. He would not love TikTok. You have an idea of delayed gratification, right? It takes you time, to read through the Harry Potter books, if you have the patience to do so. It's going to take you a long time to read through those books, right? To delay that gratification of whatever payoff is at the end of the book. And that's why, sometimes people kind of like look down on people who flick to the end of a book to find out what the ending is, because you're ruining it. You're ruining that delayed gratification. Okay. So, very importantly too, learning, and especially teaching young people, becomes a sort of intellectual and moral pursuit. You get this idea developing as, this period that we're talking about, as we move further into it, that there's something immoral about not teaching children, right? That it is a moral pursuit. Okay, I kind of ruined this slide already because I talked about everything that's on here. Because sometimes I get ahead of myself because this course is actually in my head and the slides are just a partial representation of what's in my brain. Okay, and sometimes I get ahead of myself. I'm really bad at that. I'm so sorry. So, this idea of the private and the public becomes really important, right? There are private things that stay in the home and away from certain people, and public things, which are typically, the things that go on outside the home, and these are the domain principally of men. But there's also things that you can talk about in private that you can't talk about in public because it's impolite. Right, so public knowledge, what you can discuss anywhere. Private, what needs to be kept secret from some. And again, there's going to be a lot of differences here. Only when you're deemed adult enough are you let in on these secrets, right? Only when you're adult enough do you learn, all the ins and outs of sex. You get let into the smoking room with all the men to talk politics and economics and drink whiskey and smoke cigars or whatever. All of these things are things that you're trained into. And when you're old enough, you're allowed to do those things. And for Postman, shame with literacy returns, and all learning is moved under parents and teachers, which again, I already said. Okay, now, like I said also, you get a very distinct split. And no social phenomenon is ever universal. So with the coming of industrialization, right, the upper and middle classes have children. And while technically you'd still call them children, the lower classes, their children are part of the economic system. And it takes a little while, right? As industrialization goes on, and children are working, and if you've ever read, the works of Charles Dickens, things like Oliver Twist, I'm sure you all have. If you've ever read those books, right, this is the kind of period that Dickens is describing, right, where children like Oliver Twist and the Artful Dodger, right, are working in jobs like in the factory and as chimney sweeps, right? They're doing economic activity. Well, the children of the rich and powerful, get to be on their country estates, have a governess, slowly be raised, do the Jane Austen thing where, as you become a young woman, a parade of suitors are walked before you and you choose the one you want and all of that fun stuff. It's been a while since I read Pride and Prejudice, so I hope that's an accurate summary. I haven't read it since undergrad. Okay, so anyway. Now, what will eventually happen, is that these folks, they have their children. And they cherish their children, right? They love their children. They've raised them. And they're like, wow, what a wonderful thing children are with their innocence and all of that. And then they look down here. And they see a bunch of children who are working, who are not being given an education, who are not, advantaged in the same way. And they sort of come to a moral realization that these children are just as much children as their children. Wow, that was a sentence and a half. Right? The lower class children are still children, and they have the same qualities as the children that they have and love, and so they start to grant rights. And so again, in England, in the 19th century, you start to get laws, child labor laws, saying, okay, you can't have children working, right? That's not going to be a good thing. Right, they need to be protected, and we can't use them to go down into the mines or as chimney sweeps because they're small, right? We don't want those things happening. They need to be educated, and you get the beginnings of ideas of child welfare and a social safety net and of public education, as people are like, those children need the same things that our children need. Okay. So, Postman cites a couple of ideas, I'll go through them really quickly, that he thinks strongly influenced the development of the idea of childhood. The first one coming from John Locke. And this is the idea, you may have heard this phrase before, that basically when human beings enter the world, they are, I'll highlight it. Oh, that's a pen. They are tabula rasa, right? They are a blank slate, right? And that this idea coming from Locke has a whole bunch of implications, both good and bad, right? So the idea from Locke is that, there's no pre-programming on children. They're not good or bad. They don't know anything. The only thing that happens to children is that on this blank slate, something gets written, right? Depending on who they are, who their parents are, who their teachers are, if they have them at all. So essentially, there are no bad kids, right? There are only bad parents and teachers. The mind is blank, right? And what's shameful, right? And where's that moral quality I was talking about a second ago? Well, that moral quality is if you don't put good things on the mind of a child, right? If you misform a child so that they become deviant, criminal in some way, that is a moral failing of the adults around them for Locke rather than the child, because that slate was blank, right? And you went and you wrote all your weird deviant stuff on it, right? Bad stuff, bad. That's rather effective. Never done that before. You wrote bad stuff on there and the child turned out badly. And that's your moral failing. So, other things you can, you can't see it on the, that's fine on that screen. Other things you can thank John Locke for, the idea that children need to be trained in two ways, right? They need to be trained physically and mentally. So if you were ever traumatized by gym class, you can thank John Locke, right? Because he's like, a proper education for children includes both physical and mental aspects. And another one, again, you can thank him for when I give you your grades back. I'm just going to be like, don't blame me. It's John Locke, man. That shame and credit are essential in training up children, right? We should give them credit when they do something good and shame them when they do something bad, right? So when you get that, A plus, you feel like the teacher's given you something good or you've earned it. And when you get that C minus, right, you feel shame. That's John Locke. Okay. We got 10 minutes. Still doing okay. Another aspect of this, I'm going to just kind of put a note here. This idea is not all for the good either, right? Because there's a lot of assumptions built into it that go kind of sideways at times. So if you ever want to think about, what was the philosophical orientation that would have led to something, say, like residential schools in Canada, part of it is this idea of the tabula rasa, right? The idea that children are a blank slate. Because the assumption was at that, in the 19th and then through a good chunk of the 20th century, that one of the things you could do if you wanted to take Indigenous children and make them citizens of Canada, make them properly British or Canadian, was, you wanted to be the one who writes stuff on here, right? So you would write things like, British. No, you wouldn't, obviously more complex than that, But, you would be the one who wrote things on the blank slate. So young people were taken, put into residential schools where they would be educated, in those things that were seen as proper and helpful. So every idea has its consequences. This one has, I think, had both good and bad consequences. And obviously we know the history of residential schools and what happened there. Bless you. My brain is processing slowly, but I got there eventually. I think one time in another class, I said, bless you, like 5 minutes after the person sneezed. It was very awkward. I was in the middle of a sentence. Okay. Freud. Okay. Love Freud. Herr Sigmund. I don't like Freud. Okay. Those are horns. I could draw a devil tail too if I had the time. That's very bad. Ooh. I don't know. Now I'm just being goofy. I'm sorry. It's Friday. Okay. Sigmund. So, amongst the other ideas that Freud has, right? And Freud is actually incredibly influential in terms of the development of what we think of as childhood. Principally, right, he thinks that children are not so different from adults, right? He thinks children have sexuality, right? That they are sexual beings in and of themselves, and that they have instincts, right? And that part of the process of civilization, right? And he writes this in a book called, Civilization. I won't write it. Civilization and its Discontents, right? The children have all these things: sexuality, instincts, and psychic drives, and that the job of civilizing children is to teach them to control these things, right? Essentially to repress their base desires, right? Their desire to have sex with everyone, to steal things, to eat things all the time, right? All those drives that are kind of normal in kids have to be sublimated. But, and becoming an adult, is basically the process of teaching children to sublimate their desires. Now, for Freud, this has bad consequences too, ultimately because, when you sublimate things, you repress them. And it's those things that get repressed that cause people psychic trouble later on, right? So we get, ideas that your sexuality is repressed as being a bad thing from Freud, and that sexual repression is in fact, something that needs to be undone. But it's, this idea that children are these instinctual kind of animals that, and part of the goal of civilizing them is to get them to sublimate those drives, a lot of it through education. Okay. Dewey's my last one. I feel like I had, I missed Rousseau. I skipped over Rousseau. I should never skip over Rousseau. I've got 6 minutes to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay, sorry, I skipped one. I was sad. I didn't even know it. I love talking about Rousseau. All right, Rousseau's a weird cat. I love Rousseau. So Rousseau wrote this book called Émile, or On Education, Émile, ou de l'éducation. Now, Rousseau is a weird guy. Rousseau is part of a movement, that's called Romanticism. Now, Romanticism is not about romance, despite the words. Romanticism is principally a philosophical movement that thinks that, civilization is kind of bad, and that a return to nature and the state of nature is ultimately very good. And Rousseau wrote these very influential texts on children. And what I always find really interesting about Rousseau is that Rousseau, despite having very strong opinions on children, from all we can tell, hated children. He had his own children, by various women, all of whom he committed to orphanages because he wanted nothing to do with them. So it's super great guy. The other thing, when it comes to it, he wrote this book, Émile, and a few years after he wrote it, this French marquise, came and she said, I read Émile and I so agree with everything you said that's how I'm raising my children. To which Rousseau replied, are you insane? Suggesting that maybe his ideas are more philosophical than practical. Okay, so what are Rousseau's ideas about children? So he suggests that children are good in and of themselves, right? So as opposed to someone like Locke, right? Where for Locke, children are the means to an end, right? The end is adulthood. The end is productive citizens. The end is a fully formed adult. The child is just a means to get there, right? Someone you can form. But for Rousseau, he says, no, children should be essentially cherished for what they are, right? For their innocence, for their energy, for all of those great things about children. And I will say, I hate getting up in the morning. When my 5-year-old comes in and he's so excited about life, it does make that ever so slightly better because he's like, yay, another day. And I'm like, yay, another day. I'm so sad I didn't die in my sleep. No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. I'm fine. I only feel that way until I've had coffee. It's like, I wish I was still asleep, everyone. Hello. Okay, so children's emotional needs. he says, are the closest we have to the state of nature, right? What it naturally means to be human. And so, he says children if they have energy, they have dynamism, they have strength, and they have joy, and that's so true of my 5-year-old. It was not true of my daughter, who's now 15, but she was even grumpy as a 5-year-old. I don't know why. But right, it has all this dynamism, strength, and joy. And what Rousseau suggested was that the goal should be, I'm going to erase all my doodles again. This will be my last. I think we won't have time to do Dewey. We'll talk about him on Monday. The goal of education, he thought, and what we should do with children is not to shape them into the kind of adults that we want them to be, but was actually, he thought children were kind of like a flower, right? Children were like a flower. Petals, 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 right? You can tell I failed art class at every stage. Also, my stylus is not that accurate. So, they're like a flower, right? And the flower has its lovely properties. And the goal of the educator, is to heap some fertilizer on there and cultivate that flower, build up its inherent properties, make grow what's already there, right? So essentially you get from this very individualized, and you'll recognize this because this is what all of your parents are probably doing with you and have been doing with you since you were really little. Find those things your kids are passionate about, that they're good at, and cultivate those things, right? I mean, okay, so for some of my friends who had very high, achieving parents, it was like, no, we don't want to find those things. We want to make those things. You will be good at the piano. You will play the violin and you will be amazing. But Mom, I don't, nah. That was not my parents. My parents were very chill, but I had some friends who were like, I practice violin 16 hours a day. I'm like, oh, that sounds wonderful. But right, this idea, right? We need to cultivate what's there and find what children are, right? Their essence. So, you probably had your parents do this, right? Trying to find those activities that you were good for, right? If you were good at hockey, it was like they were going to drive you to hockey. They spent their entire life when you were a child driving you all over hell's half acre and spending half of their earnings on hockey, right? You can blame that on Rousseau, right? Because that's like, find what your kids are passionate and good at, and build those things, fertilize them, help them develop those kinds of qualities. Okay, I think that's enough on Rousseau. We'll talk about Dewey on Monday. We'll finish off with our history. I've only got a couple slides left, and then we will talk about generations.